Okay, so this is the second little video where we're going to look at how energy flows through ecosystems, and we're going to start with the producers and explain how the energy flows through them, then go on to the herbivores, then the carnivores, and then we'll have some sort of summary of how things work at the end. So in an ecosystem then, we talk about food chain, where energy flows from the producer to the consumer, to the secondary consumer, to the tertiary consumer, etc. Each of those words, producer, consumer, secondary consumer, is a trophic level. It's a position in the food chain. As well as looking at how energy flows, we could also just look at how matter flows, how carbon flows, how much each part of the food chain weighs, if you like, and how the food moves between them. And we can weigh the food rather than count its energy content. Or I can look at its energy content. And we're often interested in how efficiently does that energy move from one level to another, because it turns out that's a very good explainer of why some habitats have got lots of species and some not many, and we'll get back to that. And then last but no means least, we'll look at how do humans maximize efficiency of energy transfer. So we'll look at food chains, trophic levels, how you measure biomass, how you measure energy, how efficient transfers are, and how humans maximize efficiency of energy transfer. So here's food chain. We looked at this and we said, look, the food chain on the left-hand side, the idea is that the arrow represents the way in which energy is moving, that the producers capture it, they capture the sun energy and convert it into potential chemical energy, and then that potential chemical energy is handed along the food chain. So for this example, from the algae to the shrimp, to the small fish, to the bigger fish, to the enormous pike, to the unlikely looking bird at the top. And then we said, okay, that's a food chain, but they tend to be a bit too much of a simplification, because usually more than one thing eats each species, or each species eats more than one thing. So a food web is probably a better representation of how energy or matter flows through ecosystems. And there's one of those on the right-hand side. And we said, be a bit careful with this because there's a bit of a problem with it. A herbivore is a primary consumer. So really it should say primary producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers. And then the thing they've labeled as secondary consumer, gulls, terns, wading birds, etc., should say tertiary consumer. And the thing they've labeled as tertiary consumer should be quaternary consumer. I've deliberately put a mistake in to show you how easy it is to make that mistake. Okay, a herbivore is a primary consumer. They're the same thing. So then I looked at a very quickly sort of idea of, what are we talking about here? Let's look at this yonder moose. So a moose is a very good example of an organism through which energy is flowing. And the moose is a primary consumer. It's a herbivore. So there is energy available for it to take in from the producers, from the plants. And our question is, how does the energy get converted into new moose, into the next level of the food chain? And the answer is not very efficiently. And we'll get back to the detail of this in a little bit. So this was our just first view of it. We said that, look, they don't eat everything. Some of the bits of the plants are woody and they don't eat them. They tend not to eat the roots. They tend not to eat the pollen. Of the food that goes into the moose, actually, it's a bit like a horse. Most of it comes out the other end. They just don't digest it. Of the food they do digest, most of it goes to keep the moose going and run it around the place. And then a very small fraction of the food that was available in the primary producers, in the plants, actually ends up as new body mass, as new available energy for the next level of the food chain, ends up assimilated, is the fancy word, made into new bits of moose. So before we get into the sort of detail of like each part of that sort of process, if we just look at how we actually measure these wretched biomass and energy things we've been talking about. So the biomass thing turns out to be relatively easy to do with some complications. First of all, you collect a sample of the organisms. Now remember, there is a lot of backstory in there. It needs to be a random sample. You need to avoid bias. There are issues with how you sample things. Obviously, you don't do everything because you kill them in the process. Then you kill them. Then you dry them out until you reach constant mass at 80 degrees centigrade. If it was any hotter, you'd be setting fire to things and you'd be losing mass by burning. Or what you want to know is how much mass is there. You don't want to know about the water because the water is not a biological organic compound. And what I'm interested in is biomass, organic mass. And then I weigh it, and then that tells me the biomass. Now, to get the energy, I basically start halfway through what I've done already. I start with a dry sample of known mass. I put it in a bomb calorimeter, I measure the heat produced by a change in temperature of the water, and I get an answer of how many kilojoules of energy there are for every gram of dry biomass. Now again, that's got sampling problems associated with it. There's a backstory you need to sort of keep in your head. How did I decide which bug to kill? How did I decide that I'd got a representative sample of all of the bugs? So here is a bomb calorimeter. It's a fairly simple piece of kit. Clearly it doesn't normally have a window cut into it like this one does to be able to see in. It's an insulated container containing water. And in the insulated container, there's a thing called a bomb, which is basically just a sealed up container with enough oxygen in it that you can completely burn the sample. You can completely oxidize it. When you completely oxidize the sample, that releases heat. The heat heats up the water. You measure the temperature change in the water. And then it's chemistry, isn't it? It's a specific heat capacity calculation to work out how much energy was released. So if I know the specific heat capacity of water, which is 4,200 joules per degree centigrade per kilogram, I know the mass of the water that I'm heating, and I know the temperature change, I can work out the amount of energy released. Okay, so then we went back to the beginning again and went through energy transfer at each level. And we said, look, light being converted into encapsulated energy in organic compounds by producers is not very efficient, about 2 to 3%. And there's lots of reasons why it's not efficient. So one is not all the light hits a leaf. The second is some of the light hits the leaf but doesn't hit a pigment. The third is that some of the light's just the wrong color and gets reflected. So then we looked in detail from remembering from what we know about photosynthesis and light harvesting centers, and that different pigments absorb different frequencies of light, but it's very rare for a plant to have all of these pigments. Most plants have got chlorophyll A and maybe chlorophyll B, and we can see that the chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B absorption spectrum here are missing all the middle part of the spectrum. Now that's clearly why they look green. They absorb the red end, they absorb the blue end, they reflect the green end. So even if the absorption is quite efficient, it's not going to absorb all the light because the chlorophyll just can't do that. Now there are other reasons why photosynthesis isn't very efficient, and that is the electron transport chains. Every time the energy is handed along the electron transport chain, it's not handed on with 100% efficiency. And the chemoosmotic principle applies here as well, that in the hydrogen ions that are transported into the membrane space are not absorbed with transported with 100% efficiency. And then the ATP synthase does not absorb energy with 100% efficiency, and each step of the Calvin cycle isn't 100% efficient either. And the sort of long and short of it is that if we had 1,000 units of energy reaching the outer surface of a leaf, only about 100 units of energy, 10%, is converted into is converted into potential energy in glucose. And of that energy that's been captured in glucose, most of it is actually used by the plant in respiration. So we've got these two ideas: gross primary productivity, which is how much energy is captured by the plant, and then net primary productivity, how much of that energy is left over after the plant has used its glucose for its own respiration needs. And we can write it as a little formula, which is at the bottom of this slide, that the net primary productivity is the gross primary productivity minus the respiration. And typical figures you hear are the gross primary productivity is about 10% efficient, net primary productivity is about 5%, sometimes you hear 3%, sometimes you hear 2%, nobody expects you to remember the exact number, it differs from place to place, but it's really low. And then I gave you some examples. I said have a go at doing these. It's pretty straightforward math, so you just got to plug the numbers into the equation and get the right answers, and we'll go through that today, I hope. And then we talked about why herbivores aren't very efficient, and it turns out that cellulose and lignin are difficult to digest. And I think that was about as far as we've got, but I'm going to go through this anyway. So cellulose makes up about 40% of the dry mass of plants. Lignin makes up about 30% of the dry mass of plants, so together that's 70%. They're both really difficult to digest. They require multiple enzymes and multiple steps because there are multiple bonds in them. And no animal can actually make these enzymes. They're all made by bacteria and fungi. So if an animal eats a lot of plant matter and it's trying to digest its cellulose, it does it by keeping bacteria and fungi as its gut bacteria rather than trying to do it itself, but it's very slow. So if we look at gross primary productivity transfer then, So the reason why herbivores are so inefficient is, first of all, they don't eat everything. So out of the gross primary productivity, the food available to the herbivores, most of it isn't eaten. And then out of the eaten stuff, most of it isn't digested because most of it is cellulose. And out of the digestive stuff, most of that is used in respiration. So there's only a small amount left for assimilation. So what is the small amount? Typically, it's about 5 to 10%. And it depends really how woody the biomass is. So then if we look at the next level of the food chain then, which is the primary consumers to the secondary consumers, that tends to be a bit more efficient because primary consumers aren't made of wood, they're made out of meat, and meat is much easier to digest. And here the idea is there's an available amount, most of it is eaten, most of it is digested, but again there'll be a big loss in assimilation. But for primary consumers to secondary consumers, the logic is you're not eating rubbish, you're not eating cellulose, so you can digest more of it, so your efficiency is going to be higher. So if we want to calculate the efficiency, then we use this formula here. The efficiency is the energy out divided by the energy in times 100. Plug the numbers into the formula, get the answer. I'm hoping we're going to do this today anyway. I've got 5 more minutes before I'm talking to you. Here's an example of an energy transfer that isn't very efficient. So this disgusting thing here is a cat's mouth. Cats have very few teeth. They have killing teeth, which are in the wide open gape of the cat. You can see the killing teeth. And they have meat shearing teeth at the back of their mouths and not much else. So if you look in the diagram where it says molars and premolars, those teeth work like scissors and they're very good at cutting the meat off the bone, but they don't eat anything else. Now, if you've got a cat, you know this, they're incredibly fussy eaters. So a cat is not a particularly efficient converter of primary consumer to secondary consumer. They don't eat much of the things that they kill, and their mouths aren't designed to eat much of the things that they kill. They're fussy, they eat the best bits and leave the rest. The opposite extreme is one of these things. This is a hyena. Hyenas have got a mouthful of teeth, including at the back, rounded pointed molars that are designed to crack teeth. Now actually, hyenas are interesting animals, and they have a long evolutionary record. And in the past, there have been enormous hyenas. So the picture on the left shows a hyena today. The picture on the left also shows a extinct species of hyena, which we think might have hunted things like mammoths, right? They were really big animals that it hunted, and it ate pretty much all of them. So this is a bit of a disgusting picture, but it shows the lodge of a game park in Tanzania. And overnight, 2 hyenas chased 2 deer into the game park, and the big, horrible, disgusting looking red smear on the floor is all that's left of one of the deer. The hyenas have literally eaten all of it because they have the teeth to crack all of the bones and grind up everything on them. They've even eaten the bizarre horns. God knows how they managed to do it, but they have. So a hyena is a good example of actually a very efficient secondary consumer, a very extreme example. And the reason they didn't eat the other one is they got disturbed by people coming in the morning and they ran away. All right, so if we look then basically at this idea and apply it to a whole food chain, it also allows us to answer another question, which is, why is it that when I go swimming off Combe Martin, I'm not likely to get eaten by a shark? And the answer is that big, fierce animals are rare. And the reason they're rare is, of course, that as you move up the food chain, there's less and less energy left. So if I looked at, for example, Tanzania, and I said, in Tanzania, on average, there are 10,000 kilojoules per square meter of light energy arriving on pardon me, every square meter every year. The grass can convert about 300 kilojoules of that energy into available tissues for the next level of the food chain, into net primary productivity. The grass is only about 3% efficient. The zebra can convert about 15 kilojoules per square meter per year. Now that means that the maximum amount of energy of zebra you're going to get is 15 kilojoules of zebra. How much energy is there in a zebra? Millions of kilojoules. You need millions of square meters to have enough grass to keep one of these things fed. Now, millions sounds like quite a big number, but we're talking like a few kilometers of ground, square kilometers of ground to keep a zebra fed. And then if we look right at the top of the food chain at the lion, by the time you've got to the lion, you've only got 3 kilojoules per square meter per year of energy available because of all the losses along the food chain. how many kilojoules are there in the lion? Again, probably in the top hundreds of thousands or millions of kilojoules. So you're going to need an awful lot of territory to keep this lion fed. You're probably going to need tens of square kilometers of land for there to be enough zebra, because each zebra needs square kilometers of land to have enough grass, because the grass isn't very good at converting the sun's energy into net primary productivity. So if we look at this, but there's actually something else here as well. I'm just about to run out of time and start to talk to you, and I'm going to stop there and I'll do the rest some other time.